Before we begin the story, let us know where you're watching from by leaving a comment below. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story, everyone. Willow Creek, Virginia, moved like an old melody, predictable, quiet, with pauses only locals truly understood. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your father's name, your mother's favorite pie, and the year you first performed at the town fair. For Emma, this familiarity was both a comfort and a constraint. At 19, Emma bore burdens beyond her years. While her peers tasted freedom, Emma faced unpaid bills, a silent piano, and the looming threat of losing their ancestral home, a colonial estate passed down through generations. To the bank, the house stood as a testament to time. Broad porches, peeling white paint, and windows that rattled in the Virginia wind. But to Emma, it was sacred. Every creaking floorboard whispered tales of her childhood, of early morning music lessons, and her father's laughter before everything changed. Her father, Henry, once owned a quaint furniture workshop on Main Street. He crafted wooden chairs with hands weathered by time and meticulous care. His work was said to have soul, but that soul had eroded with rising taxes, competition from cheap imports, and a heart attack that left him frail. Now, he spent his days in silence, surrounded by dust-covered tools that seemed frozen in time. Emma's mother, Clara, worked long shifts as a receptionist at Willow Creek Medical Clinic, lines deepening beneath her eyes with each passing week. "We'll get through this," she always reassured, her voice worn but resolute. Yet Emma knew the harsh reality of their financial situation, and it weighed heavily on her. Amidst it all stood Emma, bright, fragile, and extraordinarily talented. Her fingers danced across piano keys like wind through wheat fields. Since childhood, music had been her refuge, not just in playing but in the silences between notes, conveying more than words ever could. Her sanctuary was the church at the end of Maple Lane. Each morning, before the town awoke, she'd sit at the old upright piano and play to empty pews, finding solace in the quietude. But even music couldn't stave off reality. The house faced foreclosure with a deadline of 90 days. Emma had tried everything: teaching piano, performing at weddings, even offering her late grandmother's ring for sale. Nothing made a dent, and with each passing day, the weight on her chest grew heavier, testing her belief in change. Then came the knock. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon, the sun dipping behind trees as Clara opened the door and gasped, hand to her chest. Emma looked up from the living room and froze. On the porch stood Eleanor, former piano instructor, mentor, a woman Emma hadn't seen in over 5 years. "May I come in?" Eleanor's voice was crisp but not unkind. Her gray hair was tightly pinned back, lips painted bold, a woman who had left Willow Creek and reinvented herself. The living room felt too small for what followed. Eleanor declined the tea Clara offered, sitting upright with her leather bag on her lap, a secret waiting to be revealed. "I've come with a proposal," she began, eyes fixed on Emma. "It may seem unconventional, but it could save your home and give you the future you deserve." Emma blinked. "What kind of proposal?" Eleanor leaned forward. "There's a man in New York, James Carver. He's a respected figure in the music industry. Brilliant, powerful. But lately, his reputation has suffered a public divorce, rumors, scandals. His board seeks stability, a new image." "And what does this have to do with me?" Emma asked, heart racing. "He needs a wife," Eleanor explained. "Not a lover, not a conventional partner. Someone of integrity, grace, and an unblemished reputation. Someone the media can't tarnish, who can stand beside him and restore what his ex-wife dismantled." Emma stared in disbelief. "You're suggesting I marry a stranger?" Eleanor didn't waver. "It's a contract. 1 year. You'll live in his home, attend public events, play the role of a devoted spouse. No intimacy is expected, just stability." Silence fell like a curtain. Emma glanced at her mother, who had turned pale. "The compensation," Eleanor continued, "is $200,000, enough to pay off your mortgage, provide comfort for your father." She paused for emphasis. "James will fund your debut album, complete artistic freedom, studio time, musicians, distribution." Part of Emma wanted to laugh, another part to cry. The idea was absurd, transactional, cold. Yet beneath it all, a door creaked open in her mind. A possibility. A way out. Clara rose abruptly. "This is indecent. Emma isn't for sale. I never said she was, Eleanor said gently. But she's not just a girl anymore. She's a woman with a gift, carrying a family on her shoulders, and she deserves to choose for herself. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. Moonlight outlined water stains above her bed. She thought of her father's rough hands, her mother's tired eyes, the piano's sound at sunrise, and the dreams she'd set aside to survive. In the silence, something shifted within her. Not resignation, not greed, but purpose. She wasn't selling her soul. She was buying a chance for them, for herself. When morning came, she found her mother in the kitchen, tears falling into her coffee cup. Emma knelt beside her. I'll do it. Clara shook her head. No. Yes, Emma said firmly. I'll play the role. Sign whatever they ask. Just promise me one thing. Clara met her eyes. Promise me I won't forget who I am. Outside, Willow Creek began another ordinary day. But Emma knew nothing would ever be ordinary again. In a Manhattan high-rise, far from Willow Creek, James's assistant received a call that quietly altered the course of both their lives. The bus ride from Willow Creek to New York took 13 hours. Emma barely slept, her head resting against the cold glass, the small-town lights of Virginia fading behind her like distant stars. In her lap, a single worn duffel bag held everything she was allowed to bring. Eleanor had insisted on keeping things minimalist. The contract she was to sign required discretion. No social media, no goodbyes. Just silence and a one-way ticket to a life that didn't belong to her. She stared at her reflection in the window. Wide eyes, soft freckles, hair in a loose braid, 19, still untouched, still innocent, in a way that made the world seem louder than it was. But beneath her quiet demeanor was a storm she hadn't known how to name until now. Desperation, fear, hope, and something dangerously close to defiance. By the time the Manhattan skyline appeared in the distance, Emma no longer felt like a girl clinging to survival. She felt like a thread pulled into a tapestry she hadn't chosen. But maybe, just maybe, she could still decide what picture it would become. Eleanor met her at the terminal. No cameras, no phones, just you and your name, she said, handing Emma a folded dress and a navy blue garment bag. You'll change at the hotel. He's expecting you by 6. He, not Mr. Carver, not James, just he, like a character in a fable, a cold, invisible force that ruled her fate before she even stepped into his orbit. The Sterling Tower stood like a polished monolith against the Upper West Side sky. All glass and ambition. Emma had never seen anything so pristine, so painfully perfect. Marble floors, quiet elevators, bellmen who didn't speak unless spoken to. She felt like a shadow slipping into someone else's life. And then the door opened. James Carver. He was taller than she expected, mid-42nd, maybe, a few gray strands near his temples. Though they only added to his sharpness, every movement was precise, not rushed, not warm either, just studied, calculated. His charcoal suit fit like a second skin. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and measured, like someone who had learned long ago that silence carried more power than volume. Miss Harper, he said, extending a hand, thank you for coming. She took it, surprised by how cold his skin felt. Not cold like ice, cold like steel. I assume Eleanor explained the arrangement. Emma nodded. He gestured for her to sit. They were in his living room, though it looked more like a showroom. Expensive, elegant, impersonal. A grand piano stood untouched near the window, its cover closed. As if guarding memories no one dared awaken. You'll be given a private room. We'll make a few public appearances together. Galas, dinners, charity events. You're free to play music when you wish, as long as it fits the schedule and the contract, Emma asked, her voice softer than she intended. What are the terms? James pulled a folder from a drawer and placed it in front of her. Standard legal terms, no intimacy, no obligations beyond what's outlined. 1 year. At the end, you'll receive the full amount plus ownership of your album rights. You'll be free to walk away. He watched her closely, as if trying to detect doubt beneath her still expression. I won't ask you to pretend anything in private, he added. But in public, you'll be my wife. The words hung in the air, not like a promise, like a headline. Emma picked up the pen. Before signing, she asked quietly, why me? A pause, then James looked away, his eyes drawn to the piano behind her. Because you remind me of a time before everything became performance. Her breath caught. He turned back. And because you haven't been broken yet. She signed. The first days passed in silence. Emma was given a wardrobe curated by someone she'd never meet. Dinners were served by house staff she barely made eye contact with. James's presence was distant, his footsteps more frequent than his words. He never invaded her space, never crossed lines, but he watched, always with that same unreadable gaze, like he was searching for something only music could explain. Every morning, Emma sat at the breakfast table alone. Every evening, she walked the penthouse halls like a ghost in borrowed skin, until one night, unable to sleep, she wandered to the piano. The lid creaked softly as she opened it. Her fingers found their place. She played, not for anyone, not even for herself, just to remember what it felt like to breathe. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that behind the half-closed door of his study, James had paused mid-call, listening, not moving, barely breathing. The sound of her music slipped into the cracks of his fortress like light through broken glass, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir, something that had nothing to do with contracts, with appearances, with image, something dangerously close to longing. In the weeks that followed, Emma kept playing, and he kept listening, still silent, still distant. But something had shifted. One morning, she found a steaming cup of tea on the piano bench, her favorite blend from her hometown store. No note, just the scent of honey and familiarity. The next night, her music books were missing from her room. She panicked, only to find them neatly arranged in the piano room beside a fresh bouquet of white camellias. Gesture by gesture, he was speaking without words. She began replying, cooking him a southern dish he hadn't tasted since college, leaving a post-it note with a melody suggestion, lingering a few moments longer near his study door when she played. Their conversation had no voice, but it had rhythm, and each note brought them closer to something neither of them dared name yet. The Sterling Tower didn't feel like a home. It felt like a decision, a vertical kingdom of glass and silence rising above the chaos of Manhattan, like it was too proud to listen. At the very top, tucked behind floor-to-ceiling windows and guarded by walls too smooth to carry pictures, lived the man Emma had agreed to marry. Not by love, not by desire, but by necessity. And still, nothing about this place felt real until he walked in. James Carver. His name alone was enough to silence entire rooms. A titan in the music industry. A man whose instincts shaped global hits, signed rising stars, and pulled the strings behind some of the most powerful contracts in the business. But none of that mattered to Emma when he stood in front of her that first time. What she noticed wasn't his reputation. It was the stillness. He entered like a shadow before a storm. Quiet, composed, with eyes that seemed to carry too many unfinished stories. His suit was charcoal, impeccable, his tie black silk, his shoes shined with discipline, but his expression, it was unreadable. Not cold, not cruel, just guarded, as though he had built a fortress so high even he couldn't see out of it anymore. He didn't offer a handshake this time. Instead, he looked her over, politely but thoroughly, and gestured toward the living room. "Come," he said, "we should go over the expectations in person." Emma followed, hands clasped tightly in front of her. The room smelled like cedar and leather. There were no photographs, no clutter, just clean lines, expensive silence, and a grand piano sitting untouched in the corner, like a sculpture of something that once breathed. "I'm aware you already signed the preliminary contract," James began, his voice low and even. "But now that you're here, I'd like to confirm that you understand what this arrangement requires. In this house, there are 3 rules." She nodded silently. "1," he continued, "this is a partnership, not a performance. We show up together when required. You don't need to pretend anything beyond basic civility. 2," he added, walking past the piano without looking at it, "we respect each other's space. You'll have your own room. I won't intrude." She swallowed. "And 3, no press, no personal posts, no leaks. Everything stays between us." Emma nodded again. Her voice stuck somewhere between nerves and uncertainty. "Understood." Then something shifted. His gaze softened, just slightly. "You're younger than I expected," he said, almost like a confession. "But Eleanor speaks highly of you." She offered a small smile. "And you're colder than I expected." He blinked, just once. Then, to her surprise, he laughed. It was brief, a small, dry chuckle that barely touched his lips. But it was real, and in that moment, Emma saw it. The man behind the mask. Not the executive, not the strategist, but someone tired, human. He sat across from her, You'll find this situation strange at first. So will I. But I believe in keeping things clean. No confusion. No misinterpretation. She tilted her head. Is that how you live your whole life? Yes, he replied. Or at least I try to. Silence settled again. Not uncomfortable. Just cautious. Like two strangers learning to speak the same language without using words. The first evening passed quietly. Dinner was served by staff. They sat at opposite ends of a long table. Barely speaking, Emma picked at the roasted salmon and saffron risotto. James barely touched his food. When the plates were cleared, he stood. I'll be working in my study. You're free to explore the penthouse. There's a small library, a music room. Use them as you like. Thank you, she said. He paused. If you ever feel, he hesitated, choosing his words with surgical care, overwhelmed. I trust you'll speak to Eleanor or me directly. This isn't a prison. No, she thought. But it's not exactly a home either. Still, she nodded. Understood. Then he disappeared behind a door, and she was left alone with the quiet hum of the city outside and the echo of silverware still ringing in the air. Days passed like pages turning in a book she hadn't written. Emma moved through the penthouse with silent grace, touching nothing, changing nothing. Her room was modern and simple. White linens, clean surfaces, no trace of anyone who had ever lived there before. She found solace in the library, a room lined with books that smelled of age and solitude. There, she read poetry and practiced music theory. But she never touched the grand piano, not yet. James, for his part, kept to his routines. Early mornings in meetings, afternoons reviewing files, evenings in the study. He rarely initiated conversation, but when he did, he was always polite. One morning, she passed him in the hallway. He stopped. You play every morning at your church, don't you? She blinked. I did. He nodded once, then kept walking. That night, she dreamed of Willow Creek, of her father's hands on her shoulders, of her mother humming in the kitchen, of playing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata for an empty chapel. She woke up with a lump in her throat, and before she could stop herself, slipped out of bed, padded barefoot to the music room, and lifted the piano lid. She didn't even know what she was playing at first, just letting her fingers follow something that felt like breath. She didn't notice the door creak open behind her, or the figure standing in the shadows, watching. It wasn't until she paused, sensing eyes on her, that she turned. James stood by the doorway, still in his suit, his tie loosened, his face unreadable. You're very good, he said softly. She closed the lid, embarrassed. I didn't mean to disturb anyone. You didn't. A beat. That song. Was it yours? No, she said. Just something that needed to come out. He nodded, then stepped closer to the piano. Not to touch it, just to look. I used to play, he said. She raised an eyebrow. Conservatory, he added, almost reluctantly. Before my father died, before everything else. It explained the piano, the silence, the way he listened. You gave it up? She asked. No, he replied. I buried it. The air between them shifted. Not romantic, not yet, but intimate. Pain. Recognizing pain. Music. Recognizing music. And Emma, sitting at that piano, began to wonder if perhaps this arrangement, this strange, fragile truce, was not about saving reputations. Maybe it was about remembering something both of them had forgotten how to feel. From the outside, their life looked seamless. Photos began to surface of Emma and James at charity events, gallery openings, black tie dinners, always impeccably dressed, always the perfect distance apart. Emma wore navy or cream, sometimes red, but never anything too loud. James, as always, was sleek, sharp, unshakable. The press labeled her the Southern Muse. They called him the Ice King. Together, they were a headline, a strategy, a story, but behind the penthouse walls, the silence between them stretched long and wide. They lived like guests in the same hotel, passing in hallways, sharing polite nods over breakfast. She never asked where he went. He never asked what she played. Even their meals were prepared and served in separate dining rooms unless they were expected to be seen together. He was respectful, generous even. Her wardrobe expanded weekly. Her piano was tuned to perfection. She had access to a small recording studio on the lower floor, but affection, emotion, connection, absent. There was no cruelty, no arrogance, just emptiness. At first, Emma found comfort in the distance. It gave her space to grieve everything she'd left behind, The weight of her family's debt, the shame of agreeing to this marriage, the ache of abandoning her old life in Willow Creek. But the more she got used to the silence, the more it began to echo, until one morning, the silence was interrupted, not by James, but by instinct. It was raining outside, not the romantic kind of rain, but the steady gray curtain that soaked the city and left no room for sunlight. Emma, wrapped in an oversized sweater, walked barefoot into the living room. She hadn't slept. Her thoughts had been too loud. Memories of her father's laughter, her mother's tired smile, the smell of morning coffee in their small kitchen. Without thinking, she sat at the grand piano and played no sheet music, no goal, just feeling. The keys were smooth under her fingers, familiar, like a long-lost friend. She let the chords move through her, let the sorrow of distance and the ache of displacement shape the melody. Upstairs, in his office, James froze. He heard her. He always heard her. But today was different. She wasn't just playing. She was speaking without words. She told a story of a girl who missed her home, who didn't know if she belonged here, who was trying desperately to find herself in a world that felt too polished, too rehearsed. He stood, walked to the railing that overlooked the living room, and watched. Emma didn't notice him. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted slightly, her body swaying with the rhythm. There was a vulnerability in her that stunned him. She wasn't performing. She was releasing. He didn't know the notes, but he knew the feeling. It hit something in him he hadn't let surface in years, not since the funeral, not since the silence after his father's last breath swallowed his dreams whole, not since he folded his musical ambitions into a drawer marked childish and stepped into a suit that didn't belong to his soul. He took a breath, then turned away quietly so she wouldn't see. He wasn't ready. Not yet. From that day on, something subtle changed. She began playing more often, and he began lingering closer. He would find reasons to walk past the music room, to pour tea in the kitchen near the sound of her notes, to pause outside the door and listen for just a few seconds longer than necessary. One night, after returning late from a board meeting, he found her curled up on the couch with a blanket and a Chopin book. She looked up, startled. "You're home late," she said. He loosened his tie. Lost track of time. She hesitated, then held out the book. "You said you used to play. Do you remember this one?" He glanced at the piece. "Nocturne in E-flat major. I used to love that one," he said. She smiled. "Play it." He shook his head. "It's been years." She didn't push, just nodded. "If you change your mind, the bench is warm." He didn't reply. But something lingered in the air between them, like a note suspended in the pause before the next chord. The next morning, Emma woke to something strange in the piano room. On the bench sat a handwritten composition, just a few bars, delicate, unfinished. It wasn't hers. She picked it up, studied it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the melody there was grief in it. Longing. Hope that didn't know how to name itself. She played it softly, filling in the gaps, then left it on the bench again, adding 3 more lines. That night, the paper had moved, and another section had been added. A new ritual was born. He never said it was him. She never said it was her, but they both knew they were writing something together, not just music, something fragile, something healing. Then came the morning she found her favorite Southern biscuits on the table, fresh and still warm. No note, no explanation. She smiled. That night, she left a recording of one of his favorite classical pieces playing softly from the sound system in the library. He didn't comment, but he lingered. The boundaries between them were shifting, not with grand gestures, but with stolen glances and quiet offerings. One evening, as she played near the balcony, she caught his reflection in the glass, watching her from across the room. Their eyes met. He didn't look away, neither did she. And though neither of them spoke, something passed between them that felt louder than words. Something unspoken, unresolved, unavoidable. The first real conversation they ever had didn't start with words. It started with a note, just one. A low, aching A, held a second longer than it should have been, then a minor third, layered gently over a shifting chord. Emma wasn't thinking when she played it. Her fingers moved as if something in her had remembered a melody, not hers, but buried deep in someone else's soul. The apartment was quiet. James was gone for the day, or so she thought. She sat alone at the grand piano as the rain painted the windows, her fingers improvising in the quiet, like she always did when emotion built up with nowhere to go. But this time, it was different. The melody came with weight, with shape, with a pulse. It was beautiful in the way forgotten things often are. Fragile, uneven, full of ghosts. She didn't know how long she played, but when she stopped, she heard it. A breath. Not hers. She turned and saw him. James was standing in the doorway, still silent, still in his coat, his scarf damp, his shoes still wet. But something in his eyes wasn't weather. It was memory. Sharp. Unwelcome. Vulnerable. That melody, he said quietly. Where did you hear it? She blinked. I didn't. It came to me while I was playing. He stepped closer, slowly, as if the sound still lingered in the air between them. I wrote something like that, he said, eyes focused not on her but on the keys. 15 years ago, I never finished it. Her breath caught. Where? He pointed to the piano. There. This piano, in this room. His voice lowered. I was still trying to be someone else back then. A composer, a dreamer, before my father died, before I took over the company. She watched him sit beside her, not touching the keys, not even looking at her, just sitting. She felt the shift again, not in the room, in him. I called it restoration, he said, but I never got past the opening. She touched the same keys again, softly, let the notes return, and he slowly joined her, one hand, then the other. Their bodies barely touched, but the harmony did. It met between their hands, in the spaces where their eyes didn't dare meet. They built it together, note by note, pain by pain. He added a sequence she never would have thought of, dissonant, jarring, and she answered it with something gentle, like an apology to the chord he didn't know how to soften. No words were spoken, but something was said, something real, something raw. When they finished, the final chord echoed into the wood of the piano, trembling before it vanished into the silence. Neither of them moved. Then, finally, Emma looked at him. You still remember how to play, she whispered. He smiled. Barely. He never forgot. I just stopped believing it mattered. It does, she said, her voice firmer now. It always did. The next morning, the music room had changed. The sheet music for restoration sat on the piano stand, ink still drying from James's pen. Emma added her own notes beside his. They didn't talk about it, but they didn't need to. For the first time, the contract between them wasn't about image, it was about music, about what they both had buried. He scheduled studio time without telling her, just handed her a small card after breakfast one day with an address and a time. She looked at it, then at him. You want us to record it? She asked. He didn't answer with words, only a look, and that look was enough. The studio was nothing like Emma expected. It wasn't cold or corporate, it was warm. Wooden floors, soft lighting, the scent of coffee lingering in the air, the kind of space where vulnerability was welcomed, not shamed. Luca, the producer, greeted them like old friends and asked for nothing except truth. What are you playing? He asked. James looked at Emma. She answered, something unfinished. He smiled. Aren't we all? They played restoration 3 times. The first take was technical, flawless, but empty. The second was too emotional. Emma's hands trembled on the keys. But the third was silence before birth. It started slow, with James taking the lead, his touch on the keys no longer restrained but intentional, even tender. Emma entered halfway through, matching him, weaving into his melody as if she had been born from it. Their styles, his rigid, hers fluid, met in the middle, not in compromise, but in harmony. When the final note faded, no one spoke. Not the engineer, not Luca, not even James. Emma looked up and saw it. His eyes were wet, but no tear fell. He stood, walked out of the booth, and didn't come back for 10 minutes. She didn't follow. She didn't need to. She understood. That song wasn't just music. It was a doorway, a reckoning, a confession too deep for language. Later that evening, Luca approached her privately. You know this track will go places, right? He said. Once it's out, people will ask questions. We didn't make it for them, she replied. He grinned. No, but that's exactly why they'll care. She didn't tell James that restoration had been accidentally uploaded to a private stream and shared among a few industry contacts. She didn't tell him when the views passed 50,000, or when the comments exploded, or when people started calling them the soul duo nobody saw coming. What mattered wasn't the attention, it was the way James looked at her the next time they sat at the piano, like she wasn't a contract or an asset, but someone who had given him something he thought was lost. And though neither of them said it aloud, the silence between them had changed. It wasn't cold anymore. It was charged, alive, and quietly waiting for something neither of them dared name yet. When Emma stepped into the studio again, the air already felt different, thicker somehow, charged with something she couldn't quite name. Anticipation, maybe, or the quiet thrill of walking into a room where something real had happened once and might happen again. This time, there were more people, more eyes, more attention. Luca greeted them with a wide smile and a quiet nod, as if trying not to spook the delicate magic that had been born between them. "The buzz is growing," he whispered to Emma as she set her things down. "People are asking if you're releasing more." She blinked. "We haven't even talked about that." "Then maybe it's time." The recording of Restoration had gone viral. Neither Emma nor James had planned it. It had been meant as a private creation, a way to reclaim the part of themselves they had both abandoned, but now it was out there. On playlists, in editorials, even whispered about in high-level music meetings. A young woman with haunting beauty and a forgotten billionaire who once trained as a classical pianist, suddenly re-emerging together. The media loved it. But Emma wasn't sure if James did. Not yet. He hadn't said a word about the attention. Not when her name began trending online. Not when Luca showed them the streaming numbers. Not even when the label offered to sponsor a full-length album on the spot. Instead, he just sat at the piano beside her, opened a new sheet of music, and said quietly, "Let's start again." Their process was unlike anything Emma had known. James worked with a precision that was almost unnerving. He heard flaws most ears would miss, rearranged chord progressions with surgical confidence, and rarely praised, but he didn't need to. The way he played beside her was the compliment. She, on the other hand, brought feeling. She would hum melodies mid-take, stop suddenly to rewrite a line, or change tempo based on nothing but instinct. And while it drove the sound engineer half crazy, James never stopped her. In fact, he adjusted, he learned her rhythm, and she learned his. They weren't just recording an album. They were building something between them, with no words and no rules. Only emotion. One track, titled Shadows, came from a moment they shared late at night. Watching the rain from opposite ends of the living room, Emma had stood by the glass, silhouetted by the city lights, her profile calm and unreadable. James had watched in silence, not knowing she'd seen his reflection behind her. The next day, she brought the idea in. He added the bridge. It was, Luca would later say, like listening to two people fall in love in real time. But Emma didn't dare call it that. Not yet, because James never crossed the line. Even as their fingers brushed on the keys, even when he lingered a moment longer beside her in the studio, even when his eyes softened just before he looked away, he was still the man who lived behind walls. But now, those walls had cracks, and something warm had begun to seep through. Then came the day the label sent a team to document the process. Photos, interviews, behind-the-scenes footage. It was supposed to be standard, but nothing about what Emma and James shared felt standard. She watched him stiffen as the cameras arrived, saw his posture become more formal, his jaw tighten as the questions turned from music to personal. "So, James," one of the interviewers asked casually, "is it true this marriage started as a publicity move?" Emma froze. James paused, then smiled without warmth. "We agreed to help each other, and yet," the interviewer pushed, "the chemistry between you is undeniable. Are you saying it's still just business?" There was a silence. Too long. Too charged. James looked at Emma, then, not the interviewer. His expression softened, just enough for the camera to catch it. "I'm saying," he replied carefully, "that what we're building now can't be measured by contracts." Emma held his gaze. The room, the crew, the questions, everything else faded. And in that moment, something shifted again. Not a declaration, not yet, but something closer to truth than they had ever dared admit. By the end of that week, they had recorded 6 original tracks. Their album was no longer a concept. It was a heartbeat. And the world wanted it. The story of Restoration had opened a door, and now everyone wanted to step inside. Critics called them unexpectedly electric. Music blogs praised Emma's purity and James's ghost-like precision. Former colleagues of his began reaching out, some congratulating, others warning, because fame came with weight. And theirs was suddenly real. One evening, after a long session, Emma returned to the penthouse to find James in the library. He wasn't reading. He was playing, quietly, alone, not rehearsing, just playing. She stood at the door for a while, letting the sound settle into her, then stepped inside. Is that new? She asked softly. He didn't look up. No, just something I used to play before I forgot who I was. She walked over, sat beside him. You're not that man anymore, she said. He looked at her then, really looked. No, he murmured, but I think you brought him back. The air between them tightened. She reached forward and touched the edge of the piano, not daring to reach for him. What are we doing, James? A long pause then. Something that scares me. She didn't answer. She didn't need to, because the silence said enough. It always did. The next morning, Emma awoke to news she didn't expect. Restoration had been nominated for a prestigious international award, not as a debut, not as a gimmick, but as a pure, transformative composition. James brought the article to her over breakfast, folded, quiet, his eyes unreadable. I don't want the attention, he said. I know, she replied, but I think the world needed to hear it. He nodded slowly. Then maybe we keep going, finish this album together, properly. She studied him and saw it behind the composure. Fear, hope, longing, all colliding in one quiet sentence. She reached across the table, gently touching his hand. No contracts, she whispered. No walls, he agreed. And just like that, the pact they had signed months ago began to dissolve, not in ink, but in feeling, because the music they had created together wasn't a project anymore. It was a beginning. It was supposed to be a night of celebration. The Lincoln Center gleamed under golden lights, its marble steps filled with music patrons, fashion icons, and a sea of photographers shouting names Emma didn't recognize, but who all seemed to know hers. She wore a dark emerald gown that caught the light with every step. James, by her side in classic black tie, looked more relaxed than usual. The rumors swirling around them had turned from suspicion to fascination, no longer contractual, no longer curious. They were now the couple everyone wanted to believe in. They had just finished performing a stripped-down version of Restoration in a private pre-gala set. It had been intimate, raw, and haunting. People stood. People cried. Emma's hands had trembled after the last note, but not from fear, from knowing that what she shared with James was real, until she appeared. Vanessa Blake, ex-wife of James Carver. She came into the room like smoke, graceful, unapologetic, and designed to be seen. A vision in deep crimson, her dark hair pulled into a tight chignon, her gaze sweeping the crowd like a queen returning to claim her court. And when her eyes landed on James, she smiled. Not kindly, not warmly, but knowingly. Emma felt it instantly, the shift in him, the way his jaw clenched, how his posture straightened by instinct, like a soldier seeing an old battlefield. She touched his arm. He didn't flinch, but he didn't look at her either. Emma Harper, Vanessa said, gliding toward them, her voice like velvet lined with ice. The girl with the golden fingers. Emma extended her hand. Miss Blake. Oh, please, Vanessa said, brushing her fingers past Emma's lightly. No need for formality. After all, we've both played the same part, haven't we? Emma blinked. Excuse me. James stepped in then, voice calm but laced with steel. Vanessa, this isn't the time. She tilted her head. Why? I'm just welcoming your new wife, the new prodigy. The next chapter of your curated restoration arc. Emma's stomach tightened. The room didn't seem to notice the tension, but it crackled between the three of them like static. Vanessa leaned in, just enough for Emma to hear what came next. Let me guess, she whispered. You were struggling, desperate, talented, but invisible, and then James offered you a partnership. No expectations, just a contract and a spotlight. Emma didn't answer, because she didn't have to. Vanessa smiled. It's his pattern. I was the first, but not the last. James stepped forward. Enough, but the damage had already been done. They left early. In the car, the silence between them was unbearable. Emma stared out the window, her reflection fractured by the blur of city lights. Her chest ached. Her fingers itched for keys, for something, anything to ground her. Don't let her get to you, James finally said. She turned to him. Did what she said have any truth? He exhaled, slow and heavy. Yes and no. Explain. He hesitated. I met Vanessa during the lowest point in my life, he said. She was young, brilliant, in debt. I offered help, sponsorship, support. It wasn't supposed to become anything romantic, but it did. Emma looked at him, sharp and quiet. And the contract? He didn't answer immediately. Yes, he said. It started as a contract. Just like this. The air drained from her lungs. I didn't plan it that way with you, he added quickly. Not exactly. Eleanor came to me. She said you were different. And now, she cut him off. Voice breaking. Am I still different? Or just another project? His voice softened. Emma, what we've built, what we're building, isn't like that. You know that. But do I, she asked, because she stood there and described my life like a chapter from your past. He didn't speak, and his silence said too much. She turned away, swallowing the rising burn in her throat. I need space, she whispered. Emma, don't. But she was already gone. She didn't go back to Willow Creek. She didn't go to a hotel either. She went to a small artist's loft Luca had once offered her for solo practice sessions. Quiet, minimal, hidden above a bookstore on the edge of Brooklyn. The moment she closed the door behind her, the tears came. It wasn't just Vanessa's words. It was the ache of uncertainty, the question that had haunted her since day one. Was any of this real? The dinners, the piano, the album, the look in his eyes after their last performance, had he ever seen her, or just the reflection of a mistake he wanted to rewrite? She stayed there for 3 days, didn't call, didn't answer, didn't play, until the silence became too loud. She sat down at the upright piano against the far wall and let her fingers move. She didn't play Restoration. She played something new, something filled with confusion, with betrayal, with longing, and at the center of it all, love. Not the easy kind, not the fairy tale kind, but the kind that asks you to stay even after your trust has been shattered. On the 4th day, there was a knock. Not at the front door, the side door, barely used, almost hidden. She opened it, and there he was. James Carver. No suit, no armor, just jeans, a black sweater, and eyes so tired they looked hollow. I couldn't find you, he said, and I couldn't breathe. She didn't move. I didn't come here to defend myself, he added. I came here to tell the truth. She crossed her arms. Then say it. He stepped inside, slowly, carefully. I never stopped punishing myself for what I did with Vanessa, he said. I gave her power, not love. I offered salvation when I should have offered honesty. He looked at her, something breaking open in his expression. But you, Emma, you were never a project. You were a mirror. You made me want to return to who I used to be, before I learned to lie to survive. She swallowed hard. And the contract? I tore it up. The day we finished Restoration, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the remains of the original agreement. Creased, ripped, useless. I kept this, he said, to remind myself that love shouldn't be written in terms. Silence then. I don't know if I can believe you, she whispered. I know, he said. But I'll wait as long as it takes. She looked at the piano, at him, at the door. Her heart pulled in every direction at once. But in the end, it landed where it had always wanted to go. Right into the uncertainty of a man who had hurt her with silence, and now stood before her, stripped of everything but truth. And for the first time, she didn't walk away. Not yet. The distance between them was no longer physical. It was in the way Emma didn't look him in the eyes when they spoke, in the way James hesitated before knocking on her door, in the way every note she played now felt like a question and every silence, an answer he didn't want to hear. They were back under the same roof, but nothing felt like home anymore. After James's visit to the artist's loft, Emma had agreed to return to the penthouse, not because she had forgiven him, and not because she was ready to fall back into whatever rhythm they'd begun to build, but because she needed clarity. And distance, ironically, wasn't giving her that. She needed to see him, to hear the truth, not once, but 100 times, to watch his actions, not just his words. But James, for all his courage in finding her, seemed to have lost his voice again. He gave her space, too much of it. He walked softly, spoke little, disappeared into meetings that took longer than they used to, and when he returned, he barely entered the music room anymore. It was as if he feared contaminating it, like their piano had become sacred and he unworthy. And Emma, she tried to believe that what they had built was real, but Vanessa's words echoed louder than James's promises. She found herself replaying everything in her head, every gesture, every glance, every time he'd touched her hand at the piano or lingered in the kitchen. Was it all orchestrated? Could someone like him really fall for someone like her? Or had she simply been a composition he wanted to finish, to feel better about the ones he'd left incomplete? The album's launch date was approaching. The label called daily. Luca left messages filled with enthusiasm, asking for final approvals, concert plans, promotional campaigns. He sensed something was wrong, but he didn't press. He just said, "Whatever you need, I'm here." Emma stared at the final mix of Unity, the track that blended all their music into one seamless piece. It was beautiful, but when she listened closely, she heard it. The tension beneath the harmony, the dissonance that never fully resolved, just like them. Then came the breaking point. A magazine published a retrospective feature titled Carver's Muses, The Women Behind the Myth. It detailed James's past, his reputation for taking in vulnerable artists, sponsoring their dreams, then vanishing once their careers were launched. There were photos, quotes from unnamed sources, even a leaked copy of the original contract between him and Emma. Her name was everywhere, and now, so was her pain. She confronted him in the living room, the article trembling in her hands. "You said this wasn't a pattern," she snapped. "But to the world, that's exactly what it looks like." James didn't deny it, didn't try to explain, didn't even reach for her. "I didn't leak the contract," he said quietly. "That's not the point," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The point is, you knew this would come back to haunt us, and you didn't prepare me. You just let it happen." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing. "I thought I could protect you by staying silent, by staying back." "Silence isn't protection, James," she said. "It's abandonment." The word hit him like a slap. And in the pause that followed, everything between them, every fragile thread they'd woven, began to fray. "I can't do this anymore," Emma said, blinking back tears. "I can't keep wondering if I'm your future or just your restoration story." James took a breath, but no words came, and that was all the answer she needed. She left the next morning. No press, no drama, just a single suitcase and her music. She went north, to Vermont, where the world moved slower and the noise of the city couldn't follow. James owned a quiet farmhouse there, one he had offered once as a retreat, a sanctuary. Now, Emma took the key without asking, and she went there to breathe. The cottage sat on a hill, surrounded by pines and silence. The only sounds were birds, wind, and the occasional soft echo of her piano when she played in the evenings. She played a lot, not the songs they had written together, but new ones. Messy, sad, angry, honest. And in those melodies, she began to find herself again. Not James's muse, not Willow Creek's girl, just Emma. Back in New York, James stayed behind. At first, he buried himself in work, meetings, contracts, award nominations. His calendar was full, but his mind wasn't present. Every moment without her felt heavier than the last. The penthouse was cold again, the piano untouched, and his chest hollow. He tried writing, he tried composing, but nothing came out. Until one night, a familiar melody echoed in his head, the beginning of restoration. But this time, it sounded unfinished again, because the woman who completed it was gone. Weeks passed. The album launched to global acclaim. It topped charts. Critics praised its raw intimacy and emotional authenticity. Emma's voice, though mostly instrumental, was called the sound of a woman reclaiming herself. But Emma didn't attend the launch. James didn't speak to the press. They were the center of a storm, yet nowhere to be found. And the world, sensing something had broken behind the beauty, began to whisper again. Were they over? Had it all been a performance after all? In Vermont, Emma played alone on a weathered upright piano in the sunlit room overlooking the trees. She didn't cry anymore, but she didn't smile much either. Her music spoke where she couldn't, and every night, as the last note lingered in the still air, she wondered, would he ever come? Would he even try? Or was that final silence between them the end? The farmhouse in Vermont wasn't big. It creaked when the wind hit the windows, smelled of old wood and lavender oil, and had a kitchen that seemed to invite slow mornings and quiet thoughts. For Emma, it felt like breathing for the first time after holding it in too long. There were no paparazzi here, no press releases, no reminders of who she had been asked to become, only silence. And for the first time in weeks, she wasn't afraid of it. She'd been in the house for 21 days, waking at sunrise, playing at sunset, writing music that didn't have to prove anything to anyone. She sat at the upright piano in the sunroom and let her fingers say what her voice refused to. The trees outside would sway gently as she played, and sometimes she imagined that the wind was listening, not judging, just listening. Sometimes that was enough, but sometimes it wasn't. Then one morning, there was a sound she hadn't heard since she arrived. Tires on gravel, a door closing, footsteps not urgent, not hesitant, just steady. Her heart stopped. She looked through the kitchen window. James. She stood frozen, her hands damp, a tea towel clutched between her fingers. He was wearing a navy coat, the same one she'd last seen him in, but his face was different, more tired, more open. He knocked once, then waited. She didn't move, so he called gently through the door. "Emma." "I didn't come for closure." She opened it, not because she was ready, but because something in his voice didn't sound like a man trying to fix the past. It sounded like a man finally brave enough to tell the truth. He stepped inside but didn't move closer. "I didn't call because I knew you needed space," he said, his eyes searching hers. "But I've been writing for you, not for the world, not for restoration. For you." She said nothing, but she didn't look away. "I couldn't finish it," he continued. "Not until I came here." Then he reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded piece of sheet music. He placed it on the piano bench, turned, and walked to the door. "I'll leave now," he said. "But if you ever want to hear what it sounds like." He glanced at her, and for the first time in weeks, she saw it again. That softness, that fear, that hope. "Play it," he finished, and then he left. Emma stared at the page for a long time before sitting down. The title was simple, just her name, Emma. The first few bars were familiar. Notes from her laughter, her favorite warm-up, the melody she often played without realizing it. Then came a motif that mirrored the piece they'd written together, but twisted slightly, like he was reshaping it from the ashes. It wasn't grand. It wasn't perfect. It was personal. She began to play, slowly, tentatively. Her hands trembled halfway through, not because of the notes, but because of what they meant. Each section was a memory. The way she laughed in the kitchen that night he burned the toast. The moment she cried silently while watching a sunset from the penthouse balcony. Come the time she fell asleep at the piano and woke up to find a blanket over her shoulders. He'd noticed everything, even when he hadn't spoken. He had been listening. The song ended, not with a climax, but with a question. An unresolved chord that didn't quite land, hanging softly in the air, waiting for her, waiting for what she'd do next. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept hearing the final note echoing inside her. She made tea, sat by the fireplace, stared into the flames. Her heart was pulling her in two directions, toward the safety of solitude and toward a love that had wounded her but never lied. Because James hadn't tried to explain anymore, hadn't defended, he just offered, and she realized then, the man who once built walls was now leaving doors open for her. The next morning, Emma packed a single bag. She left a note on the kitchen table, locked the farmhouse behind her, and drove south, back to the city that had stolen, and returned her to herself. She didn't tell him she was coming, didn't call, just arrived at Sterling Tower. The doorman didn't blink. "Good morning, Mrs. Carver," he said with a warm smile, as if she'd never left. She rode the elevator to the top, stepped into the penthouse. It was silent. She walked through the living room, past the kitchen, past the glass balcony doors, until she heard it. Piano. Coming from the music room. She opened the door slowly. He was there, playing her song, the one he'd written. But this time, he wasn't alone. Because the moment he saw her, he stopped. She walked over, without speaking, and sat beside him. He looked at her, like he was afraid to breathe. "Do you still want me to play it?" she whispered. "No," he replied softly. "I want to play it with you." And so they did, together, one note at a time. Not to fix what had broken, but to begin again, without fear, without contracts, just music, and whatever came after. The penthouse was no longer a stage. There were no rehearsed conversations, no perfectly measured distance at dinner, no invisible contracts between the lines of every look. Now, there was only a man and a woman, raw, cautious, rediscovering each other with every small act of vulnerability. It wasn't loud. It was gentle, like the first breeze after a storm. In the weeks after Emma's return, they lived quietly. James resumed his routines, but less obsessively. He still worked, still attended meetings, but now he'd return early. He'd cook poorly, but he tried. He'd sit by the piano while Emma practiced, not saying a word, just listening, present. She didn't move back into her old bedroom. She didn't need to. He hadn't asked. She hadn't explained. Some things didn't require confirmation anymore. They weren't lovers in the traditional sense, but they weren't strangers either. What existed between them now was trust, delicate, rebuilt, and still slightly trembling at the edges, but real, and that, in its own way, felt more intimate than anything physical. The album continued to climb charts across the globe. Streaming numbers soared. The title track, Unity, was featured in films, commercials, wedding videos, and international playlists. It became the sound of something new, of rediscovery, of soft rebellion, of falling not into fantasy, but into truth. The label reached out with an offer neither of them expected. A global concert, Carnegie Hall, one night only, broadcast live. They wanted James and Emma together on stage. Live, unscripted, raw. It wasn't about promotion anymore. It was about performance, not for business, but for the world. And for the first time since the beginning, the decision was entirely theirs. They sat in the music room that night, side by side. The invitation lay between them on the bench. Emma stared at the logo, her fingers hovering above the keys. Not playing, just thinking. "It's everything we said we didn't want," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "But it's also everything we created. A pose. And people think it's love," she added, "even if we never said it." James didn't look at her, but his voice was quiet, steady. "It is." The room stilled. She turned to him. His gaze met hers, and for once, there was no guarded expression, no mask, no calculation. "I love you, Emma," he said. "Not because of the music, not because of what you've given back to me, but because when I was lost in a life I didn't choose, you didn't just find me. You saw me." Her breath caught. He continued, "I don't care if it's public. I don't care if it's private. I care that you know, that you believe it." Tears burned in her eyes, but they didn't fall, because the pain had passed. What remained was choice, and she was ready to make one. They accepted the invitation, but with conditions. No promotional photo shoots, no media interviews, no carefully curated backstory, just music, just them. The night of the concert arrived like a breath held too long. Carnegie Hall shimmered in gold, every seat filled, cameras positioned quietly in corners. The audience buzzed with expectation, some wanting answers, others simply waiting to hear the soundtrack of something that had felt impossibly human in a world obsessed with perfection. Backstage, Emma adjusted her dress, a simple navy gown. No sequins, no theatrics, just elegance. James wore black. They didn't speak much before walking out. They didn't need to. When the lights dimmed and the first notes of restoration rang through the hall, everything else faded. Their fingers moved in sync. Not rehearsed, not memorized, but known. Every note was a conversation, every silence a memory. The audience didn't breathe. By the time they reached Emma, the piece James had written in solitude and she had completed with presence, the room felt less like a concert and more like a confession. And when the final note echoed through the hall, soft, unfinished, hanging in the air like a held breath, James turned to her and stood. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't check with the cameras. He just reached for the microphone. The hall fell silent. "I used to believe love was a transaction," he said, "a formality, a deal." He looked at Emma. "Until she sat at a piano in my home and played something I didn't know I'd written. Until she looked at me without expectation and loved me anyway." Emma stood beside him. "I never planned to fall in love," she said softly, clearly. "I only planned to survive." She paused, "But then I met someone who didn't rescue me." He listened, and when I couldn't speak, he still stayed. James turned to the audience. "I didn't invite you here for a performance," he said. "We came to tell you this. What starts as a facade doesn't have to stay one. Sometimes, pretending leads you to something real." He looked at Emma again. The world watched, and then he knelt, not as a show, not as strategy, just as a man ready to stop hiding. He opened a box. Inside, a simple ring. No diamond, just a small silver band engraved with a single note. The first note of restoration. "Will you marry me again?" he asked. Not for image, not for survival, just for love. Emma laughed softly, then whispered, "Only if we keep composing," and slipped the ring onto her own finger. The applause didn't erupt. It bloomed. Quiet at first, then louder, then unstoppable. But James didn't hear it, not really. Because the only sound that mattered was the yes and the future it carried. For a heartbeat, time forgot to move. James was still on one knee, Emma still standing, and Carnegie Hall breathless. The silver ring on her finger shimmered softly beneath the stage lights, but it wasn't the jewelry that held the crowd captive. It was the look between them. Two people who had stepped into a lie and emerged holding something truer than any vow ever spoken. Then, finally, she nodded, not just to him, but to everything that had brought them here. The silence shattered into thunderous applause, but Emma didn't turn to face the crowd. Her eyes stayed on James, whose shoulders sagged just slightly, like a man who had been holding his breath for far too long. She took his hand, helped him stand, and in front of thousands, without rehearsal, without any script or stage direction, she pulled him close and kissed him. It wasn't showy, it wasn't theatrical, it was soft, long, real, and the audience rose to their feet, like they weren't clapping for a performance, but for something they wished they too could find. A second chance that chose them back. The days that followed were chaos. International headlines lit up with photos of the Carver proposal. Clips of the concert flooded social media. The kiss was replayed on television. Even late-night hosts mentioned them. Not mockingly, but almost reverently. Who knew a classical piano performance would give us the love story of the year? One commentator joked. Finally, a billionaire romance that doesn't feel fake. But behind the frenzy, Emma and James did something unexpected. They disappeared. No interviews, no exclusive magazine deals, no brand endorsements, just silence. And in that silence, they chose each other again, in private. 1 week later, they stood in front of a small white chapel in Willow Creek, Virginia. No cameras, just a handful of people. Clara and Henry stood near the front, holding each other's hands with quiet pride. Eleanor, in a pale lavender dress, dabbed her eyes every few seconds. Luca played the organ gently, his fingers far less showy than usual. There were no diamond tiaras, no flower walls, just a piano covered in scratches from a decade of church recitals, and Emma, barefoot, wearing her mother's wedding dress, which had been tucked away in a cedar chest for 27 years. It fit her like a memory. James waited at the altar. No tuxedo, just a gray suit. Shirt open at the collar. No tie. As she walked down the aisle, Emma wasn't thinking of the concert, or the articles, or the past. She was thinking of the way he looked at her when she played, the way he said her name like a melody, the way he stepped back when she needed space, and leaned in when she needed strength. Their vows weren't recited from cards. They were whispered, so low that only the walls of the church and the beating of their hearts truly heard them. "I loved you," she said, "before I believed I deserved it." "I loved you," he replied, "before I even knew what love really was." And when the pastor said, "You may now kiss the bride," they laughed, because they had already kissed in front of thousands, but this time, it wasn't for the world, it was for them. Later that evening, they returned to the farmhouse in Vermont, not as escapees, but as something new. Husband and wife, no contracts, no timelines, no deadlines, just a shared rhythm crafted not from perfection, but from persistence. They ate dinner on the porch, soup and biscuits, candlelight, stars overhead. The air smelled of pine and early autumn, and just before the sun disappeared, Emma rose. She walked to the old upright piano inside the sunroom, where the window framed the last light of the day. James followed. He didn't ask. He didn't sit. He just stood behind her, watching as she placed her fingers on the keys. Then she played a melody they hadn't written, a new one. It began soft, with a pulse like a heartbeat, then grew gently, not dramatic, just true. When he joined her, it was without sheet music, without plan. But they found each other in the sound. The piece had no title. Not yet, but maybe that was the point. Some things don't need names to be real. Some love stories begin as facades and end in symphonies. And as the final note rang into the warm quiet of their home, James leaned in, whispered just above her ear, "Let's never stop composing." It wasn't the beginning they imagined. No penthouse views, no red carpets, no stage lights, just 2 mugs of coffee, a front porch, the hum of morning birdsong, and the soft tapping of piano keys drifting from inside their farmhouse. It was quiet, but it was real. And after everything they'd survived, quiet was a miracle. Emma and James settled into their new life in Vermont, like 2 people learning how to breathe again, together. They didn't rush. There was no pressure to turn their story into a brand, no urgency to prove that their love had lasted past the applause. They simply lived, and in that gentle rhythm of living, they began creating something even greater than music. They began creating legacy, The first seed was planted on a chilly morning in November. Literally, Emma stood in the small barn out back, running her hands over dusty old benches left by previous owners. She turned to James, who had come in holding 2 cups of tea and an idea too big to say out loud all at once. "What if we turn this into a music school?" he asked. She blinked. "Here? Why not?" He shrugged. "We don't need a label, or charts, or tour dates. We just need a piano and students." She stared at the space again, all that old wood, all that potential, and she smiled. 6 months later, the Carver School of Music and Healing opened its doors. They didn't advertise it, they just opened. And word spread quietly but quickly. Students came from everywhere. A girl from rural Maine who'd never touched a real piano, a young man from Atlanta who played by ear because no one had ever taught him to read music, a widow who hadn't sung since her husband's funeral 10 years ago, a 1-2-year-old with autism who communicated best through cello vibrations. They didn't just come to learn, they came to feel, to reclaim something they'd lost. Just like Emma once had, just like James still did every single time he touched the keys. And it wasn't just music they gave away, it was freedom. No tuition, no audition tapes, no prerequisites, only one question on the application: what does music mean to you? The answers, more honest than any curriculum could have planned. "It's the only time I don't feel broken. It's how I talk to my mom who passed. It's the part of me I didn't know I was allowed to love." James read every application himself. He never looked at their resumes, only their answers. Emma, meanwhile, spent her mornings teaching children how to trust their own sound. She'd sit on the wooden floor with toddlers who banged on drums, and with shy teens who blushed when they missed a note. Her gift wasn't just talent, it was presence. And every now and then, when the sun hit the window just right and she caught her own reflection mid-chord, she'd smile, because she didn't look like the girl from Willow Creek anymore. She looked like the woman she fought to become. They still played together, but never for crowds, only in the evenings, when the fire crackled in the hearth and the world softened around them. They'd improvise duets. Sometimes jazz, sometimes classical, sometimes something in between. James often claimed he was rusty. Emma always rolled her eyes. "You're just afraid I'll outplay you," she'd say. He'd grin. "You always did." And then he'd start playing anyway, because love, as they'd learned, wasn't about being perfect. It was about choosing to stay in the room, even when the melody changed. One spring evening, a familiar face knocked at their door. Eleanor, still elegant, still sharp, but softer now, somehow, like someone who had finally exhaled. She sat with them on the porch, sipping mint tea and watching a student's recital through the window. Her eyes welled as she whispered, "I always knew your music would matter, Emma, but I never imagined it would matter like this." Emma took her hand. "You didn't just teach me to play," she said. "You taught me to listen, even when it hurt." Eleanor smiled, then turned to James. "And you," she added, "finally let the music say what words couldn't." He looked down, humble but proud, because she was right. The man who once hid behind silence now lived inside harmony, not for business, but for love. A year passed, then 2, then 5. The world moved on. New artists, new scandals, new sensations. But restoration still played at weddings. Unity still made people cry in their cars. And once a year, without fail, Carnegie Hall would replay the concert, the one that wasn't supposed to be a love story, but became the one people still whispered about long after the headlines faded. They never returned to that stage. They didn't need to, because the greatest performance of their lives was never the one under lights. It was the one they gave each other. Every morning, coffee, touch, patience, presence. A love so quiet it thundered. And on the rare nights when doubt crept in, when Emma wondered if she'd done enough, or if James feared returning to the shadows, one of them would walk to the piano, play a single note, and the other would answer. That was the promise they'd made, not to be perfect, but to always respond. Even if the melody was uncertain, especially then, because love, they learned, was not about never losing your way, it was about composing your way back together. In the end, it wasn't the contract that brought Emma and James together, not fame, not music. It was the silence between one note and the next. It was the daily choice to listen, even when it was easier to run away. Because true love, sometimes, doesn't start with a kiss. It starts with someone choosing to stay,